All right, everyone, greetings and welcome back to our Sunday school class called C.S. Lewis Beyond Narnia, where we are looking at the fictional works of C.S. Lewis beyond his Chronicles of Narnia. And so we're continuing our discussion on the Ransom trilogy, and today begins our discussion on the third book in the trilogy, which is called That Hideous Strength. But before I begin, I have a prayer request for you / announcement. This week is the PCA's General Assembly, which is taking place in Chattanooga. And we have several folks from our church that will be attending it, including myself, Pastor Tommy, and our ruling elder, Chip Peebles. So we will be representing River Oaks at General Assembly. So I'm leaving this afternoon. The weather forecast is not looking pretty. It's going to be hot, and I'm bringing my whole family too. So pray that my family would have a good time while we're there and that they would stay cool. And please pray for all of us to that goal. So that said, are we ready to discuss C.S. Lewis today? Okay, let's get into it. So you can see our class schedule. Here's where we are currently. So today is the 22nd of June. So we are beginning a discussion on That Hideous Strength. We're going to spend 3 weeks on That Hideous Strength because this is the largest book in the trilogy. It's actually larger than the first two books combined. So we're going to need a lot of time to unpack the themes from this book. Today, my goal will be just to walk you through the plot. You know, just like I've done with Out of the Silent Planet and with Paralandra, today I'm going to walk you through the plot. So that is my goal. Let me begin by just commenting on the title. Does anybody know what the title, That Hideous Strength, comes from or what it refers to? It is directly relevant to the plot of the novel. It is a phrase that comes from a 16th century English poet by the name of David Lindsay. And in his poem that mentions this line, that hideous strength is a reference to the Tower of Babel, the story of the Tower of Babel in the book of Genesis. And it's relevant because it's the theme of how humans rebel against their creator by using technology to try to transcend their human limitations. That is at the heart of the plot of this novel. Now, to give you some context for understanding That Hideous Strength, there are some other writings, nonfiction writings by C.S. Lewis that help shed light on what he's trying to do in this book. By far, the most important book by Lewis that sheds light on the meaning of That Hideous Strength is The Abolition of Man. This is a book that I teach to my students at Westminster Academy every year. I've taught it every year for the past 10 years. It is probably my favorite nonfiction book by C.S. Lewis. It's very important. It's very prescient. That is, he is able to predict exactly what direction is our society going in, and he is anticipating changes in our worldview that are happening in the 21st century. He was able to do this in the 1940s when he first delivered these lectures, which were then published as a book. It is crazy. But the title itself, The Abolition of Man, refers to our loss of humanity. Humanity is designed by its creator to be tethered to an objective moral order. When we separate ourselves from that objective moral order, we lose our humanity. That is exactly what happens to the villains in That Hideous Strength. So we're going to be talking about that today. Some other writings of Lewis that are relevant for understanding this novel. There is a book that is a collection of C.S. Lewis's essays, which was published after his death. That book is called God in the Dock. It's a terrific book. There's a wide range of topics covered in the essays in this book. Two that are relevant for understanding That Hideous Strength would be the humanitarian theory of punishment and vivisection. These ideas both play a role in the plot. So the humanitarian theory of punishment is basically C.S. Lewis's critique of a modern concept of criminal justice, which sees the duty of society as not punishing criminals, but rehabilitating them. Lewis was very concerned about that because he thought that by eliminating the concept of punishment, you are depriving human beings of their moral dignity. The choices we make have moral value. They deserve praise or they deserve blame. When you remove punishment from the criminal justice system, you are basically treating humans as subjects of experimentation rather than as morally significant agents in their own right. Another problem with what he saw as the humanitarian theory of punishment is that if the goal of criminal justice is to punish the criminal, there's a definite limit you can place because the punishment has to fit the crime. But if the goal is to rehabilitate the criminal, there's no limit, right? It's whenever the experts decide that this subject is rehabilitated, that's as long as the treatment goes. So Lewis was concerned that this would basically take the criminal justice system out of the hands of the people who all have a sense of conscience, and put it in the hands of so-called self-appointed experts who decide for themselves what are the effective and appropriate treatments. And so that idea will figure in the plot. The concept of vivisection as well. So that's, like doing lab experiments on living creatures, animals and humans. This was a modern concept when Lewis wrote this book, and you're going to see how it plays into the plot as well. And then lastly, this is another very significant theme in the novel. Another book of his written after his death, The Weight of Glory, which is a collection of essays. I think The Weight of Glory itself was originally a sermon that he delivered. But there's an essay in there called The Inner Ring, where it's talking about humanity's desire to be on the inside, to be part of the elite, to be part of the cool crowd. And that is very much at the heart of the ambitions of one of the main characters within the novel, as you're going to see. So, if you want more context to understand the plot for That Hideous Strength, those are the writings of Lewis that I would recommend to you. But now we can move into the book itself. And I wanted to start by sharing with you a clever meme that I found on the internet for That Hideous Strength. There you have it. This is a pretty good description of the plot of That Hideous Strength. You can imagine it as a fifth of whiskey, okay? It starts out pretty slow, but by the time you start getting into it, it totally grips you, it draws you in, it totally reorients your entire thinking. So yeah, you can see, starts off with a slow start, but then by the end you are fully convinced that our scientists are talking to demons. You're going to see how the plot develops in this direction. I also say this as a warning because the novel That Hideous Strength has a very, very different feel from the first two novels in the trilogy. Out of the Silent Planet and Paralandra are both interplanetary travel novels, and so there's a lot of descriptions of exotic scenes, and the plot is constantly driving forward with new experiences and new sights and new imagery. That is not at all what's happening in That Hideous Strength. The entire plot takes place on planet Earth in England, and rather than being a interplanetary travel novel, it would be better described as a bureaucratic conspiracy thriller. So you're going to see I had some fun with ChatGPT generating some AI images for this book as well, but a lot of these images are just going to be people dialoguing. There are a lot of main characters and side characters in this novel compared to the previous two. In the previous two, you could pretty much count all the main characters on one or maybe two hands. There's a lot more in That Hideous Strength. So it's a little bit harder to follow the plot. That's why I'm going to need the entire lesson today, the entire hour today, to get through the plot of That Hideous Strength. So with that said, let me introduce you to the main characters of the novel. The plot centers on a young married couple called the Studdocks. There is Mark and Jane Studdock. That's Studdock. They're in their early to mid-20s. They've only been married for about 6 months now, but they're not too happy in their marriage. They're both wrestling with a feeling of discontent, but for different reasons. It's also worth mentioning that they are intentionally childless. They are not intending to have any kids, at least not now and possibly not ever. Because Mark is pursuing his career ambitions as a junior sociology professor at a certain college called Bracton College, which is a college of the University of Edgestowe. Edgestowe is a small town in the heart of England where most of the plot takes place. Mark himself, he's a pretty ambitious guy. He has what Lewis would call inner ring syndrome. He's the one who wants to be on the inside. He wants to be among the elite. He wants to be in the know, part of the cool kids crowd. On the other hand, Jane is lonely and bored and spends most of her day at home, wishing that she could continue her own academic pursuits. She has this dream of like pursuing a doctoral dissertation in the English author John Donne, but she's had to put that aside for now as Mark pursues his career ambitions, and so she's frustrated by that. She doesn't quite have inner ring syndrome like Mark does, but what she has is this strong sense of individualistic autonomy. So you could say that each of these characters has their own character flaw. Mark has the inner ring syndrome, and Jane has this autonomous individualism problem. But there's another problem that Jane is dealing with as well. She's having very bizarre dreams. And in the beginning of the book, she recounts a nightmare that she had just experienced, where she sees a man who speaks French, and he's in a prison cell. And he's visited by another man who is described as wearing a pince-nez. That's like, like the little glasses that rest on your nose, that pinch your nose. And he has a pointed beard. And he comes in, and there's this conversation that unfolds between them. And then the dream takes a very bizarre turn. The man in the glasses puts his hands around the head of the prisoner and twists his head off and removes it. And at that point, the dream morphs into another scene where there's another man who seems to be buried in this crypt or vault underground. And Jane sees there's people like trying to dig down to him from above. But at this point, the man rises up. At first she thought he was a corpse, but no, he's actually alive. And he starts speaking something that kind of sounds like Spanish, but she doesn't recognize the language. And so she's really disoriented, she's really disturbed by these dreams that she's having. Then the scene shifts to a description of the college itself, where Mark teaches. There is a particular wooded area that's part of the property of the college. So this is Bracton College, and the wooded area is called Bragdon Wood. And there's a story behind Bragdon Wood. Legend has it that there's a well that's located in the wood, and legend has it that Merlin from Arthurian legend is buried in this wood. And I guess like the college itself has a ceremony where like each new warden of the college ceremonially drinks from this well. But there's a problem with the wood. It's falling into disrepair, and funds are pretty tight at the college. And so there is a discussion that unfolds among the trustees of the college, the fellows of the college. There has been an offer that's been made to purchase Bragdon Wood by an organization called the NICE. That's the National Institute for Coordinated Experiments. These are the bad guys of the story. They've made an offer to purchase Bragdon Wood. Now, the faculty, the fellows of Bracton College are kind of conflicted over this question. But there's a particular faction within the college known as the progressive element. This is the inner ring. These are the cool kids. They're the ones pushing for the sale of Bragdon Wood to the NICE. Are you tracking with me so far? Because this is kind of setting up everything. So, at this trustee meeting, the progressive element uses intimidation tactics to push successfully for the sale of Bragdon Wood to the NICE. And Mark himself is at this meeting, and he finds out that one of the leaders within the progressive element is this character named Lord Feverstone. He's the one who kind of leads the conversation, pushes it in the direction of selling Bragdon Wood. It also turns out that Lord Feverstone played an instrumental role in getting Mark appointed to his position as a junior fellow at Bracton College. I'm going to come back to Lord Feverstone in just a moment. Meanwhile, Jane is shopping in town, and she meets an older lady named Mrs. Dimble, who is the wife of Dr. Dimble, who is the former tutor of Jane. So back when Jane was doing her, academic pursuits, her tutor was this character, Dr. Dimble. So she meets his wife in town, and they invite her over for lunch. It turns out that the Dimbles, Dr. Dimble himself, works for Bracton College, but it turns out that the Dimbles are going to be evicted due to the sale of Bragdon Wood. Because as a professor of the college, his house is on the property of Bracton College, and that was part of the property that was sold to the NICE. So they're wrestling with what are they going to do next now that they're going to lose this home that they've lived in together for years and years. At that point, Dr. Dimble starts talking about the legend of Merlin as it's connected to Bragton Wood, and he wonders if the NICE have ambitions to dig up Merlin for their own nefarious purposes. We'll find out that that actually is the case. At that point, Jane starts talking to them about these nightmares that she's experienced, and the Dimbles become very concerned. They become very alarmed when she describes these nightmares to them. They suggest that Jane talk to a friend of theirs named Grace Ironwood, who lives at a certain estate near the town of Edgestowe called St. Anne's. St. Anne's is a very important, so keep that name in mind. That is the location of the good guys, okay? The good guys live at St. Anne's. So the Dimbles encourage Jane to talk with this lady, Miss Ironwood, Grace Ironwood, at St. Anne's. And she's not sure if she wants to do this or not, because she doesn't want to get, caught up in these associations that might, threaten her own sense of independence. And so she thinks about it, but she leaves. Meanwhile, Mark gets invited over to dinner with Lord Feverstone. That's the guy who, was pulling the strings to get Mark appointed as a professor. He's the one who pushed for the sale of Bragton Wood. It turns out Lord Feverstone is none other than Dick Devine. If you remember from Out of the Silent Planet, there were two villains that kidnapped Ransom. One of them was Weston, and we learn more about Weston on Paralandra, right? But the other villain was Dick Devine. He was the one who had these greedy ambitions for harvesting gold on Mars. Well, he comes back, and he is one of the main villains within That Hideous Strength. He's kind of risen up the ranks himself, so he has a lordship, and he's on the faculty at Bracton College, and he's connected with the NICE as well. And he, at this dinner with Mark and some of the other members of the progressive element of Bracton College, Lord Feverstone explains some of the benefits of the NICE being involved at Bracton College. And he talks about how he shares the ambitions of this organization to use science to recondition the human race. There's kind of this transhumanist worldview that the organization is pushing for. And at that point, Lord Feverstone asks Mark to use his expertise as a sociologist to document the experiments that are currently being conducted by the NICE. So he's basically offering Mark a job with the NICE. And so he invites Mark to come with him to the headquarters of the NICE at Bellbury. So there are two locations you need to keep in mind. There's St. Anne's, that's the location of the good guys, and there's Bellbury. That's the headquarters of the NICE. Those are the bad guys. Well, Mark goes back home, and the next day he talks with his wife, Jane, who is still upset about her nightmares. And Mark he sees that she's upset, so he offers to stay home with her for the day. And she's kind of offended, because again, remember, she has this strong spirit of independence. She doesn't want to be treated like this damsel in distress or this helpless little woman. And so she's kind of upset with Mark. And so they have this minor argument. So Mark ends up leaving. He joins up with Lord Feverstone to go visit the NICE headquarters at Bellbury. Meanwhile, Jane decides, okay, because she's so upset about her nightmares, she is going to talk with this Miss Ironwood lady that had been suggested to her by the Dimbles. So she goes to St. Anne's. So when Mark arrives at Bellbury, Lord Feverstone introduces him to the deputy director of the NICE, a man named John Wither. He's like the chief villain of the story. This deputy director, Wither, there's like tiers of bad guys in the novel. He's like top tier bad guy. And he's characterized by his constant use of evasive and vague and bureaucratic language. You can never get a straight answer out of this guy. It's so frustrating. The way he distorts languages so that he can basically say nothing through a lot of words. That's the characteristic of this guy throughout the entire novel. Mark, therefore, cannot get a clear answer from him as to what exact position Mark is being offered or who he'd actually work under in this organization. So he doesn't want to press too hard because he doesn't want to fall out of the good graces of the NICE, but he leaves that meeting with a sense of frustration because he has no idea what he's actually supposed to do for these people. So he starts wandering the hallways of the building, the headquarters, and he encounters another Bracton professor, an older, more senior professor named Bill Hingist. Bill Hingist has only started to make connections of his own with the organization, and he doesn't like them. He can smell a rat. He recognizes that this organization is up to no good. So he decides he's not going to have anything to do with these guys. He tells Mark he's leaving the NICE, and he's going to leave Bellbury that evening and say good riddance to the NICE, and he advises Mark to do the same. He says, this group is up to no good. You don't want to have anything to do with them. I'm going to come back to this Hingist character in just a moment. Meanwhile, Jane arrives at St. Anne's, and she is introduced to this lady, Miss Ironwood, and she describes the dreams she's been experiencing to Miss Ironwood, and the response of Miss Ironwood is very unexpected. Miss Ironwood tells Jane that her dreams are actually real. They're actually prophetic. She actually has a supernatural gift that she has inherited. And so Jane is encouraging, Miss Ironwood is encouraging Jane to join with them so that they can help her, so that she can learn how to use these dreams. She also explains to her that initial dream she had of, there's like the professor-looking man twisting the head off of the prisoner. That prisoner was a real person, a criminal named Francois Alcassan. Alcassan was a radiologist who was convicted of having poisoned his wife, and he had just been executed by guillotine. And so, as Jane realizes that at least Miss Ironwood thinks her dreams are real, she's really disturbed by this. And also, Miss Ironwood warns her that it's possible that their enemies might be aware that Jane has this gift as well, and so they want to protect her. But Jane, she's still fearful of being taken in. She doesn't want to be caught up with these conspiracies or with these groups of people. And so she says, well, I'll think about it and get back to you maybe. And so she goes back home. Meanwhile, Mark continues meeting people at the NICE headquarters, and he encounters a very unpleasant lady by the name of Fairy Hardcastle, Miss Hardcastle. She is the chief of the NICE police. She's kind of like a second-tier villain within the story. And as the plot unfolds throughout the course of the novel, you do find out that she is actually a sadist and probably a lesbian as well. She's a very unpleasant character, and she explains to Mark the need for a private NICE police force with government powers to back it up. And she advocates for the superiority of this humanitarian or therapeutic treatment of criminals versus punishment. So you remember there's that essay that Lewis wrote on this very topic. She is the embodiment of the ideology that C.S. Lewis hates. This idea of the humanitarian theory of punishment, that is what she is advocating, because she's using this approach to criminal rehabilitation to advance her own powers and to pursue her own sadistic ambitions as well. Later, Jane has another dream. She dreams that there's a man walking in the night who is attacked and brutally murdered. It turns out that this dream comes true as well. This is actually Bill Hingist being murdered. That's the Bracton professor that was talking with Mark and warning him not to join the NICE. After he leaves from the headquarters, we find out the next day he had been murdered on his way home in the middle of the night. And there are no suspects. Nobody knows who actually committed it. At that point, the Dimbles, remember them, they get evicted from their home. Mrs. Dimble, therefore, stays for some time at Jane's place in the town of Edgestowe. And it's at this point that Jane discovers that her dream of Hingist's murder actually came true, and she realizes that she does actually need help. And so she becomes more open to getting help from the folks that are living at St. Anne's. At this point, Mark is getting more frustrated by the lack of clarity about exactly what his position would be with the NICE. So he wants to go back and talk with the deputy director. He talks with Miss Hardcastle, the chief of police, venting his frustration. Like, he wants to know exactly what is he supposed to do for these people. He cannot get a straight answer from the deputy director. Well, at this point, he's so frustrated that he tells Fairy Hardcastle that he's considering leaving the NICE. Miss Hardcastle says that would be a very bad idea, and she urges him not to take that step. So she lets him in a little bit more on what his role exactly would be. She says part of his role is going to be to rehabilitate the reputation of that executed criminal, Alcazan. And so he's actually going to be sort of like involved in like journalistic propaganda, which is not exactly his area of expertise. Remember, he's a sociologist. But in the NICE, you do whatever needs to be done. And that's what they need him to do. So they are pushing him to write propaganda pieces in the popular papers in England. He's not so sure about this. He doesn't know if he likes this idea. So he continues walking around the headquarters. And at one point, he discovers that there's a laboratory that the NICE is holding with all kinds of exotic animals being held at it. And he can hear the roars and the trumpeting sounds and the growls of all these animals within the lab, which the NICE is using for their own experimentations. And so these animals are going to come back and figure later in the plot, as you're going to see. But this is just another manifestation of the wickedness of the NICE, the way that they're even willing to mistreat animals and human beings to achieve their ambitions. At this point in the story, Grace is invited to have a picnic with a young couple about her age, Camilla and Arthur Denniston. It turns out they're connected at St. Anne's as well. It was Camilla that had actually introduced Jane to Miss Ironwood when she arrived at St. Anne's. Well, they meet up again. They offer to take her on a picnic with them. She finds out that Arthur Denniston was actually an old friend of her husband Mark's that Mark had lost touch of as he continued to pursue his own career ambitions. You can see there's a lot of characters in this story, right? It's maybe a little bit hard to keep track of. Bear with me, though. Okay, so when she's on the picnic with this young couple, they're good guys, okay? They're telling her more about St. Anne's, and they reveal to Jane that there's actually an individual who leads the entire estate. They call him the director. His name is Mr. Fisher King. Mr. Fisher King. Apparently, this guy has inherited his wealth as well as his name from his wealthy deceased sister. And they want Jane to join them, but they also say they want her to ask Mark first because they want to honor Jane's marriage as well. Well, Jane takes offense at this because, she has this independent spirit. She doesn't think she needs to get permission from her husband to do what she wants to do. But she does end up telling them that she'll at least let them know if she has any more dreams. She's not yet willing to join St. Anne's yet, though. Meanwhile, the situation deteriorates in the town of Edgestowe. There's a fog that descends on the town at this point, and there's tensions rising between the NICE and the townspeople. The NICE has purchased more and more land. I think they've purchased the entire Bracton College at this point, not just Bragdon Wood. And they're doing all kinds of various construction projects, and they're tearing down old buildings and trees. They're polluting the river, and they're bringing in foreign workers to do this labor, and it's causing tension with the locals. And the NICE is like basically pushing propaganda in the newspapers to make themselves look like the good guys in this situation. At this point, Jane has another dream. She has a dream that she is lying in bed, but she's visited by this man with the pince-nez and the pointed beard. Remember, this is the guy that twisted the head off of the prisoner from the first dream. Turns out that this individual is Professor Frost. He's another one of the top-tier villains of the NICE. And at this point, we realize that the NICE actually does know of Jane's existence and is trying to find her. So in her dreams, there's this character who's actually like taking notes at her bedside. She realizes that she is being observed by the bad guys. And so this is really upsetting to her. Meanwhile, Mark is being brought further and further into the inner ring of the NICE. He's brought into confidential meetings in the library of their headquarters at Belbury, and he's told to write a report on a riot taking place in the town of Edgestowe. And the purpose of the report is to provide support for the government granting emergency powers to the NICE. Here's the thing, though. No riot has yet happened in the town. He's meant to report on this riot before it has even happened. It turns out that the NICE is secretly orchestrating the riot. They were the ones orchestrating the tensions with the townspeople in order to expand their own power over the town. So basically, Mark knows that they're intending to incite a riot, and they're intending for him to write propaganda pieces to make them look like the good guys to expand their powers. This is the first time where Mark is being pressured to do something that he knows is wrong. But he so desperately wants to be in the cool kids crowd that he goes along with it, and he does it. He writes these reports for them, which get published in the local newspapers. And sure enough, that's how events unfold. Jane then has another dream. She dreams that she's being imprisoned in that vault. You remember that second dream she had immediately after the first dream? She's inside this vault or this crypt where she sees that bearded corpse again. But then there's another man who appears in the dream. And this is a man who looks like he has golden hair. He looks like this heroic figure. But as soon as she sees him, the dream ends. Well, then Jane wakes up, she goes to town, and she's horrified to see, in the crowds, among the NICE workers, she recognizes that evil Professor Frost who had been visiting her in her dreams. She realizes that this is a real person, that she's in danger, so she immediately decides to go back to St. Anne's to get her help. It's at that point where she recognizes, I need their help because I am in danger. So she goes back to St. Anne's, and they actually take her to visit the director, Mr. Fisher King, which turns out to be none other than Ransom. So he is the leader of the good guys at St. Anne's. And she describes her experience of being taken into this blue room where Ransom is sitting on this sofa, and he looks like he's 20 years old because he's been given the gift of eternal youth because of his voyage to Paralandra. He's also described as having a bandaged foot. He's wounded on his heel, and the wound will never heal on earth. So he's always kind of in this constant state of pain, like periodically wincing from the pain. And the storyline describes how when Jane first encounters Ransom, her world was unmade. She was struck by Ransom's kingliness. She feels this sense of awe. And at this point, she knows, like, she's going to obey this guy. He is the embodiment of pure goodness, and she feels this sense of reverence towards him. But Ransom is reluctant to let Jane join them because he knows that Mark works for the inner ring of the NICE, which is, their sworn enemies. So he suggests that Jane encourage Mark to leave the NICE. And Jane, she's skeptical that that's going to work. She thinks Mark is going to do his own thing, and she doesn't see why she would need to get his consent for her to join them. So again, she's kind of taking offense. But Ransom says that she needs to submit to her husband because he honors the value of marriage. His masters honor the value of marriage, and so she needs to as well. So she feels very conflicted about this. She goes back to town. When she arrives back in town, the riot has finally broken out. There's pandemonium everywhere, chaos everywhere. There's people rioting in the streets, and then the NICE police, they're going around the streets as well. Well, at one point, they apprehend Jane. They arrest her. They take her to some interrogation room. This is where Fairy Hardcastle and her goons have apprehended Jane, and they start to interrogate her to find out what does she know about St. Anne's. It takes kind of a disturbing turn here. They actually start to torture Jane. Fairy Hardcastle uses her cigar basically to put minor burns in her shoulder. But they run out of time, and they have to get back to Bellbury, and so they try to bring Jane with them, but they're overtaken by some of the rioters. Jane manages to escape, and she makes her way back to the safety of St. Anne's, where they treat her wounds. She heals pretty easily, and she then meets some more of the characters at St. Anne's, including, it's going to get kind of weird, a bear. She meets a bear by the name of Mr. Bultitude, who is one of the residents of St. Anne's. It turns out that one of the gifts that Ransom received on Paralandra, in addition to eternal youth, was the ability to tame animals, wild animals. And so Ransom has tamed this bear, Mr. Bultitude, who kind of roams about the estate property and is friends with everyone. He's the nicest bear you'll ever meet, but he's kind of unaware of his own imposing size. So he's kind of like bumping into everybody. But that's Mr. Bultitude the bear. He's going to come back in the story. You'll see. Then Mark falls deeper and deeper in with the inner ring of the NICE, who want him to write more articles to expand their power. At this point, the deputy director, remember his name is Wither, he tells Mark that he's heard that his wife Jane has become mentally unstable. And they encourage Mark to bring Jane so that she can be treated at their headquarters at Belbury. Mark is reluctant to do this because he doesn't see what Jane has to do with the NICE, but he's also afraid of losing the good graces of the deputy director, and so he's conflicted again. But it turns out that Mark was actually just a pawn for the NIC all along. They didn't really want Mark to begin with. They wanted his wife Jane because they knew about her visionary powers. And so they were using Mark to get to his wife. And it turns out that this order to bring Jane to their headquarters at Belbury comes not from the deputy director himself, but from the very head of the NICE, who is called the head, who is literally a head. Yes, you know, like the head of that executed prisoner Alcazan? There's like this dark chamber in the depths of the NICE headquarters where they have his head attached to all these tubes and medical devices and so forth and dials where they're keeping his head alive. And the head can actually talk to them and give them orders. Yes, this is where the story takes a very bizarre turn. But this is the leader of the NICE. Jane actually has a dream about this. She sees this head being visited by these three figures in medical clothes, but she recognizes that one of the individuals who's talking with this head is her husband, Mark. She realizes he's been drawn all the way into the very inner circle of the NICE, and she's terrified. And Ransom tells Jane that they're going to rescue Mark from the NICE if they're able to, but they need a plan. Well, at this point in the story, you know, all the members of St. Anne's, they gather together, and this is where we kind of learn about, like, what is the actual goal of the NICE and what will the company at St. Anne's actually do about it. Jane learns more at this point about Ransom's background, how he has traveled to Mars and to Venus. Also, interestingly, this is where the Arthurian legend comes in. Jane learns that Ransom also has the title of the Pendragon. For those of you that are familiar with the story of King Arthur, that is one of the titles of King Arthur, the Pendragon. He's called the Pendragon of Logres, which was like the old Welsh name for England. So it turns out Ransom is actually the successor of King Arthur. And so at this meeting, they discuss how the town of Edgestowe is actually located at the heart of this legendary kingdom of Logres, and how Merlin indeed is buried under Bragdon Wood. And they talk about how the NICE's interest in Bragdon Wood proves that they have actually had demonic help. They're not just doing this on their own. There are actual real dark spiritual powers that they are tapping into to learn about the powers of Bragdon Wood. You may recall, Earth is called the silent planet, right? Thulkandra in the old solar language. The angels that inhabit Earth are fallen angels. They're called the Dark Eldils. And the Dark Eldils are the ones who are influencing the leaders of the NICE. So they discuss how the goal of the NICE must be to resurrect Merlin and to harness his powers so that they can reshape humanity according to their own nefarious purposes. At that point, back at Belbury, Mark gets called into a meeting with the deputy director and Fairy Hardcastle, and they threaten him with accusing him of the murder of Bill Hingis. Remember that old professor from Bracton College who was murdered? They claim to have found his wallet at the scene of the crime. But don't worry, Mark, we're going to keep it a secret as long as you do what we tell you to do. They want Mark to bring Jane to Belbury. At this point, Mark realizes, like, okay, not only is his career in jeopardy at this point by falling in with these guys, his life is in danger. And so he leaves this meeting. They've warned him, stay at Belbury, just right for your wife to come join you. He kind of overcomes this internal resistance, maybe of an actually supernatural nature. He overcomes this resistance, and he escapes from Belbury. He flees back to town. He finds his home deserted. He's looking for Jane everywhere. He can't find her. She's gone. He doesn't know where. But he finds evidence there that Mrs. Dimble had been living there. Remember the Dimbles? So he goes to see Dr. Dimble, one of the professors at Bracton College, and he has an argument with Dr. Dimble. He demands to know, where is his wife? Dr. Dimble knows she's at St. Anne's, but he's not going to tell Mark where she is because he knows that Mark is one of the bad guys, and he doesn't know to what extent is Mark responsible for all that's been happening in the town. Remember, there's like rioting happening in the town. The NICE police have taken oppressive measures. People have even died. And so Dr. Dimble doesn't know if Mark's a good guy or not. All he knows is he's associated with the worst people. So at this point, Dr. Dimble says, okay, if you really love your wife and you care about her safety, here's what you need to do. You need to leave the NICE. And Mark says, well, I don't know if I can do that. And Dr. Dimble says, that's the only choice you have. Like, I'm not going to tell you where your wife is if you're still part of the NICE. So Mark says, okay, well, give me some time to think about it. Give me like an hour to think about it, at least. Well, he leaves, and when he leaves, he gets arrested. And he's charged with the murder of Bill Hengist. This is kind of Mark's own rock bottom experience. He knows that at this point, he might actually die, either at the hands of the NICE or the hands of England's criminal justice system. And at this point, he looks back on his life, and he has finally recognized the hollowness of the philosophy of those whose approval he had sought. He recognizes how it didn't actually get him what he truly desired. It only left him worse off. So he's starting to feel his own regret for the course of his life. At this point, Jane has another dream. She finds out that Merlin, the one buried in that crypt, has actually awakened. And it turns out, though, there is a secret tunnel out of this crypt that leads beyond the property that had been purchased by the NICE. So the company at St. Anne's actually has an opportunity to beat the NICE to Merlin. So they're trying to get ahead of the NICE so they can meet up with Merlin so he can join the good guys rather than the bad guys. So Jane says she recognizes the entrance of the tunnel. There's like this white gate outside the tunnel that she'd recognize if she saw it. So some of the company of St. Anne's, they come with Jane and they start looking around the outskirts of the Bragton Wood property to try to find the entrance to this tunnel to see if they can find Merlin before the NICE does. Well, at one point, it starts raining, and they find themselves in... So here's a new vocabulary word that I learned about in this book. Does anybody know what a dingle is? A dingle is basically just a small wooded valley, like a dell. It's just yeah. They find themselves in a dingle, which has a tent in it, and there's a campfire in it. It looks like it had been the encampment of some homeless person, a vagrant or a tramp, but they don't see anybody there. So they're looking around. At one point, though, they do catch a glimpse of what appears to be a homeless man on a horse, but then they lose him. And so they decide they have to go back to St. Anne's. Meanwhile, Professor Frost, one of these high-ranking bad guys in the NICE, the one in Jane's dreams, visits Mark in his prison cell. And he explains to Mark that the NICE has actually been subjecting Mark to a conditioning process in order to make him more objective. Yes, they've been threatening him. Yes, they've been intimidating him. But that's only to enable him to achieve pure objectivity, to overcome his own emotional reactions, which are really just chemical processes. And so we get a little bit more insight into Professor Frost's worldview. He's a strict materialist, and he values pure objectivity, not being taken in by moral sentiments or human emotions. And so he explains that that this is part of the worldview of the NICE, and he also explains to Mark that the voice that has been speaking through the head of the prisoner Alcosan, the actual head of the NICE, it's not actually Alcosan himself. It's what Professor Frost calls a macrobe. So you know how, microscopic organisms that are sort of at a lower level of intelligence than humans, we call them microbes? Well, Frost says there are also such a thing as macrobes, beings that exist at a higher level of intelligence than human beings, and these are the ones who are actually speaking through Alcosan's head in the depths of the NICE headquarters. these are the demons. He doesn't call them demons, but they are the dark eldils of Earth. And Frost wants to ally with these macrobes in order to commit basically global genocide, to reshape humanity so that the elites are the ones left in power, so that they can reshape human evolution itself by means of a technocracy. So here we find out these are the ultimate plans of the NICE. Back at St. Anne's, the company have a discussion among themselves over this and that, but then they hear somebody at the door. And so Ransom and one of the other members of the company, they go to the door, they open it, and who do they find standing at the door? None other than Merlin himself. That man that they'd spotted on a horse that they thought was a homeless man in the woods, turns out, no, that actually was Merlin. And he's been guided by, this supernatural influence to find the good guys at St. Anne's. Meanwhile, at Bellbury, there's another old homeless-looking man that arrives as well. So it turns out that the NICE workers, they've discovered at this point that Merlin's crypt is now empty. And some of them apprehend an unconscious naked man near that the woods, near that tunnel, who appears to be a vagrant or a tramp. And they bring him on a stretcher to a room at Bellbury, the NICE headquarters. And so the deputy director, Wither, and Professor Frost, they see this guy, and they suspect it might be Merlin, and so they try communicating with him. When the guy wakes up, they try speaking with him like in Latin, and that doesn't work. The guy just does not respond to them verbally, but he does signal to them that he wants some food and he wants some beer. Back at St. Anne's, Ransom has a conversation with Merlin where Merlin, he's able to confirm to Merlin that he is indeed the Pendragon, the successor of King Arthur. And as the conversation unfolds, Merlin is very upset with Mark and Jane because they have thwarted a prophecy centuries in the making. Merlin is convinced that Jane should be executed for what she's done. What have they done? They've used contraception. So remember, they are an intentionally childless marriage because they want to pursue their own career goals. And children just doesn't figure into the picture for them. It turns out, side note, C.S. Lewis is very anti-contraception. That's just part of his belief system. Contraception was a pretty new idea in the Christian church at this point. No Christian church before the year 1930 had actually ever officially permitted the use of contraception in marriage. So it was still a pretty new concept, even at the time that C.S. Lewis was writing this. Lewis was opposed to it because he thought that it undermines the natural purpose of marriage, which is procreation. We're going to talk about that concept next week when we get into some of the philosophical themes. But it is a relevant part of the storyline here because it turns out that Jane and Mark's use of contraception in their marriage had prevented the arrival of the next Pendragon, right? The one who would have been the successor for Ransom, who would have ended the schemes of the NICE. So Merlin's really upset, but Ransom encourages Merlin, okay, you have to forgive them. We have to move forward and come up with a plan for what to do in order to defeat the NICE. So Merlin agrees to help the company at St. Anne's by receiving the powers of the Oyarsas. You guys remember what the Oyarsas are? Each planet in our solar system has its own presiding archangel over it, which is called an Oyarsa. So there's an Oyarsa for Paralandra, there's an Oyarsa for Malacandra, and for Jupiter and Saturn and so forth. So at this point, the NICE realizes that they need Mark to get on their side so that they can get to his wife in order to accomplish their plan, and the clock is ticking. So they place Mark in this room, which is called the objective room. The objective room is decorated with these bizarre and disproportionate objects, which they say is intended to strip Mark of his attachment to subjectivity. He feels a sense of disgust in this room, but that is by design. Like, all the objects in this room are deliberately slightly disproportionate in order for him to overcome his sense of properness or objective morality in favor of what they would call pure objectivity. Turns out, though, to have the opposite effect. Mark sees this room and he realizes this room is twisted. This room is wrong. And if this room is wrong, it implies there is a right. Mark resolves at this point that he's going to take sides with the normal, the straight, the correct, whatever it will cost him, no matter what the NICE does to him. At this point, the story takes a somewhat bizarre turn. Back at St. Anne's, Jane has a waking vision at this point of this lady dressed in a red robe who is like gigantic in size, who's accompanied by these dwarfs who begin mocking Jane and taunting her. This is really bizarre imagery. What exactly is going on here? This is an earthly manifestation of the goddess Venus, the Oyarsa of Perelandra. Turns out that the Oyarsas are preparing to descend on St. Anne's to empower Merlin to overcome the NICE. And Jane has this anticipatory vision of the arrival of Venus at St. Anne's. If you're not familiar with the writings of C.S. Lewis, this scene, even if you are familiar, it's a strange scene. But it is a beautiful description of how the medievals understood the symbolic significance of planet Venus. That's what C.S. Lewis is doing in this scene. Also happening at St. Anne's, Mr. Bultitude, remember that bear? He manages to wander off of the property of St. Anne's, and he encounters some of the NICE workers nearby. Well, these workers think, hey, we could maybe turn a pretty good profit if we can sell this bear to the NICE laboratory, so let's drug him and put him on our truck and bring him back to the Belbury headquarters, which they do. So Mr. Bultitude is taken away from St. Anne's and taken off to the labs at Belbury. At this point, the villains of the NICE bring Mark to the room with this tramp who's not communicating with them because there's only a limited number of people that they're willing to bring into the inner circle, Mark being one of them. And so they lock him in the room with the tramp, and when the two of them are alone in this room, the tramp finally starts talking to Mark in a Cockney accent. Do you guys know what a Cockney accent? You ever seen My Fair Lady? Okay, so there you go. He's talking with Mark in a Cockney accent and reveals to Mark that a strange man had hypnotized him and stolen his clothes. You know, when he was out at his camp in the woods, this is actually just a homeless guy. And so it turns out that Merlin, after he had awakened, took this guy's clothes, put him under a spell, and left him wandering naked, near the property of Bragdon Wood. And then he was apprehended by the NICE. As evening approaches, okay, so this is just a symbolic image here, okay? This is not literal here. I'm just trying to describe what would be really hard to depict visually. It's at this point that the Oyarsas descend upon St. Anne's, and they each arrive in succession. First it's Mercury, then it's Venus, then Mars. The interesting thing, though, is how when each of them arrives, they transform the personality of the company at St. Anne's. So Mercury gives them the gift of eloquence, and they all start speaking to each other in witty jokes and profound philosophical truths. Then when Venus arrives, they feel this sense of laughter and love. Then when Mars arrives, they feel a spirit of courage, and so on and so forth. It's at this point when all the Oyarsas arrive, they descend upon Ransom himself and fill him with their powers. The next day, the leaders of the NICE, they try to communicate again with the tramp. They're not successful, and so they had put out this advertisement to get somebody's help who has expertise in ancient languages. I'm going to try and go quick here to wrap this up. And so there's a man dressed as a Basque priest. You guys know what like the Basque territory is in Spain? So this Basque priest arrives and starts communicating with the tramp. But interestingly, the tramp starts talking back to him in this unknown ancient language. It sounds like they're communicating to each other in this unearthly language. At this point, this Basque priest turns to the NICE leaders and orders them to take him and the tramp to see the head and to see their prisoners and to see the animals in laboratories. The leaders realize at this point, okay, so this guy knows all of our secrets. So this tramp is either Merlin himself or he's working for our enemies. So they have their suspicions about being tricked, but they decide they have no choice. So they do agree to take the tramp and this priest on a tour to see the head and the animals and the prisoners. Meanwhile, Professor Frost takes Mark back to the objectivity room and has one final test for him. He orders Mark to trample on a crucifix. This is the last test he needs to pass in order to achieve true objectivity. Now, at this point, Mark is not a Christian, but he does know that the NICE stands for crookedness, bentness, and Mark wants to side with the normal, with the straight. And so he refuses to do it. At that final point of refusal, he's thinking, I might get executed for this, but I don't care. I'm going to side for the true and the good, regardless of what the NICE does to me. But at that point, the deputy director comes back into the objective room with Merlin. By the way, it turns out that Basque priest was Merlin himself in disguise. That's why the tramp was able to talk in this supernatural, unearthly language. And so they come to the objective room and say, okay, we need to get ready for the banquet where the guest of honor is the director of the NICE. This is a guy who hasn't figured in the plot yet. The guy's name is Jules, Horace Jules. He's just a figurehead. He doesn't have a clue about what's actually happening within the inner circle of the NICE, but he's like sort of like the face of the NICE. His name is Horace Jules, and he is the guest of honor at this banquet at Belbury, and he delivers this address to the people at the banquet, and as the speech unfolds, the people have this very confused look on their face because he starts talking in pure gibberish. Merlin has placed the curse of Babel on all the people at this banquet. They start talking with each other, and they realize none of them can understand one another. They all sound like gibberish to one another. And at that point, chaos breaks out. When Merlin had been taken on the tour of the lab, he actually freed the animals, and they're let loose in the banquet. This is where the scene turns violent. All these wild, exotic animals start attacking all the members of the NICE who are in attendance at the banquet. Like, people are getting killed left and right by wild animals. They're shooting each other. This is the point at which the top villains get killed as well. I'm not going to go into the specifics of how it happens, but this is where all the villains meet their demise. One scene, though, I will comment on. The deputy director himself gets mauled to death by none other than Mr. Bultitude. Okay, and that is how the leaders of the NICE finally meet their demise. Meanwhile, the town of Edgestowe, okay, we're good. We're back in business. Meanwhile, the town of Edgestowe is completely destroyed in natural disasters. It's swept away in fire and floods and landslides. But interestingly, the townspeople had already all evacuated. Each under very different mysterious circumstances. One of the townspeople talks about how they received a message from a relative. Another one says they were warned by their cat who said, "Get out now." And so in all these bizarre coincidences, all the townspeople flee from the town before it's utterly destroyed. Along with Bragdon Wood and Bracton College, it's all destroyed. But nearby, back at St. Anne's, all of the Oyarses have departed except for one, Venus. Venus is still there, preparing to take Ransom with her back to planet Paralander. This will be Ransom's final departure from Earth. But as she remains temporarily on the property of St. Anne's, all of the laboratory animals from the NICE, they start making their way back to St. Anne's, and love is in the air. All the animals start pairing up. The bears pair up together, the elephants pair up together, the horses pair up together. This is the spirit of Venus on St. Anne's. It's at this point, Ransom has one final instruction to give to Jane. He says to Jane that your husband will be waiting for you in the guest lodge of St. Anne's. He's received a letter from Merlin at Belbury to meet Jane at St. Anne's, and so he agrees to do so. So he's going to be waiting for you in the guest lodge. You need to reunite with your husband. You need to continue loving your husband. And so Jane agrees, but she's still wrestling with, like, will her husband even love her when they finally reunite? Because she's undergone this profound character transformation at this point. And she doesn't know where Mark stands anymore either after his experiences with the NICE. So Jane approaches that guest lodge, and this is the final scene of the book. Mark himself, he's made his way all the way from Belbury to this guest lodge where he's been directed, and he's internally wrestling with his own sense of regret. He recognizes at this point he has not truly loved his wife, and so he's hoping that he can still win her back at this point. And so At this point, in the final scene of the book, it is implied that they do reunite in a marital embrace, and it's implied that Venus's final act of charity is to bless Mark and Jane with the conceiving of a child who will then become the next Pendragon. That's not stated, but that's kind of implied by the plot. That brings us to the end of the novel, That Hideous Strength. And I think a little bit over time, but I think we made it. So with that said, let me just announce what's going to happen in the next couple weeks. And I know that was a lot. If you need to go back and watch the video, it's all getting recorded, so don't worry. But for the next 2 weeks, we're going to look at some of the themes, the literary and theological and philosophical themes from this novel. So come back next week, and that's what we'll do. Can I pray for us, and then we can head to church? All right, let's pray. Heavenly Father, we do thank you for this time that we have together to have our imaginations awakened, to appreciate the wonder of the world that you have placed us in. And I do pray, Lord, that you would help us to embrace our created design, to acknowledge our human limitations as a good thing, that we are created according to your purposes and made in your image. And so I pray, Lord, that we could give you honor with all of our lives and all that we do. And we thank you for this opportunity to come together in corporate worship this morning as well. We love you, Lord, and we give you the glory. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Thank you, everyone.